Most entrepreneurs and experts with podcasts are sprinting on a treadmill that's not even plugged in. They are spending years onto their show only to be stuck with slow growth, no leads, and a podcast that doesn't seem to be making any money. So today I wanted to share lessons from someone who has cracked the code of podcast growth. The host of Everything Everywhere, Gary Arndt, and I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that right. Gary's podcast is getting 50,000 downloads per day. I'm going to repeat that. Gary's podcast is getting 50,000 downloads per day, which by the way is absolutely ridiculous. That's around 1.5 million downloads every single month. Now, Gary came onto our podcast and shared a bunch of his secrets and insights around how he was able to grow his show so fast, so big, and get these insane results. So today I want to share some of those lessons with you in hopes that you can finally break past slow and steady growth and grow a podcast that does in fact attract more of the right listeners to your show, bring you way more monetization opportunities. Let's dive in. Have you ever tried lighting a fire with a wet match? Probably not, right? And it probably wouldn't work even if you did try. Well, that's really what relying on social media in order to grow a podcast feels like. And I know you've probably been told, hey, promote on social media, share promotional clips for exposure, and you've probably been doing that. And deep inside, you've probably questioned, is this actually working? Is it helping me get new listeners for the show? And I have the answer, it's not. It definitely isn't. You end up spending hours creating promotional clips only to still feel like you're screaming into an empty void. Maybe a couple of likes, but those viewership and exposure never translates to actual listenership for your show. And Gary realizes very early on, Gary actually doesn't really promote his podcast on social media. In fact, only 5% of Gary's traffic to his podcast comes from online, which is insane. And the reason is pretty simple, actually. If you think about it, social media isn't designed to grow your podcast or any podcast for that matter. Social media is a platform that's designed to keep users on its own platform. When you're sharing all these clips and stuff on social media, that's why it doesn't help you grow. You end up promoting to the wrong crowd. You post on your general feed where a bunch of people might not really care about your podcast topic. That's like going to a vegan restaurant and then screaming out, hey, who here wants to have a steak for dinner? The majority of people, it will just feel so disconnected and out of place. And the majority of your audience on social media feel the same way when they see your promotional stuff. The same way when you see other people promoting their podcast, you might think, oh, that's really cool, but you don't go ahead and click play and listen. The second thing is, the people who are on social media want to be entertained and they are going onto those platforms to either just consume short form content or written content, but not a 60-minute podcast episode. They're not built to get people off them. They're built to keep people on. So that's why social media doesn't work. Don't get me wrong, social media does have its use cases. For example, keeping top of mind for your current listeners, engaging the people who already know about your show. But when it comes to reaching a new audience, it really doesn't work. And again, Gary never used social media as a primary way to grow a show. What Gary did instead was he focused his attention on the primary platforms that listeners go to in order to discover new shows. He looked at the places where listeners were actively listening to podcasts, which is on other podcasts or podcast apps. So what Gary did was he, number one, massively prioritized featuring as a guest on tons of different shows on a bunch of podcasts to get himself exposed to a new audience. He already had a podcast and he was guesting and had the spotlight on him when he was interviewed on other people's shows. This allowed him to shortcut his way to a much bigger audience, gain massive traction, and then he could send people, that new audience, to his podcast that he knew was high value. But again, he was meeting podcast listeners, which is on other people's podcasts. But Gary also took this to another level. He completely obsessed with doing pod swaps. He found other massive shows in the space, and pod swap simply means where he would promote someone else's podcast in the show, and they will promote his podcast in their show. Essentially, you're shouting someone else out and they're shouting you out in return. He's able to, at scale, collaborate with tons of different podcasts and have them shouting out his podcast. He also did something known as feed drop. So feed dropping is a strategy where you drop someone else's episode into your feed. This is a great way to give your listeners a teaser experience by giving them a full episode of someone else's show, because his podcast was about history. He found a bunch of history podcasts that he could collaborate with and decided to pick a handful of them who had massive audiences. where he would drop their show onto his feed and recommend an episode to his audience. They would also drop onto their feed and expose their audience to one full episode of Gary's show. This allowed him to get in front of tens of thousands of the right audiences. It allowed the audience of these different shows to experience his podcast and to decipher and decide whether or not it's a podcast for them. This is a great targeted approach to podcast growth. It wasn't scattered. It was extremely strategic and intentional. He was getting himself constantly exposed to more of the right listeners. And then finally, Gary also spent a bunch of money running paid promotional ads on a bunch of different streaming platforms. Podcast streaming platforms like Castbox actually allow you to pay to have your podcast promoted on a bunch of different fees across a bunch of different shows. And he was willing to invest hundreds and thousands of dollars in order to get his show exposure because he knew his show was worth it. Instead of using social media to promote, which Gary quickly found out didn't work, he just focused all of his attention to promoting on platforms where podcast listeners were, which were on podcast streaming platforms and which was also on other people's podcasts. So that's the first lesson. Not rely on social media, but having a far more targeted approach to getting exposure for your show, reaching more of the right listeners. Lesson number 2 is this. The name of Gary's show is, of course, Everything Everywhere. Now, most people might hear that and think that's super broad. And to be honest with you, if I heard that, I'd think that's pretty super broad. But here's what his description reads. A daily podcast for intellectually curious people, interesting people, places, and things from all around the world throughout history. Now, it sounds broad, but is it really broad? Well, not quite. The show is positioned for a very specific type of person with a very specific type of brain. The kind of person that'll probably be up at like 1 a.m. and researching history stuff on Wikipedia. That's really who his show was for. And he did his absolute best to obsess over delivering a product, an episode, every single day in order to meet that listener's need. Now, the thing is, again, Gary really created his own style, his own format. Every episode he himself scripted out. This made his show stand out massively in a sea of other shows that felt the same about history. Typically, the average podcast publishes once per week. Gary was publishing every single day, and by nature of this, his show stands out. Now, this leads me to the second lesson, which is volume, right? Gary obsessed over having immense volume and output on his show. He did a daily podcast. Each time he put out an episode, he was able to compound his listenership, and he was able to shortcut the time for people to build a like, know, and trust. Because if you think about it, with any podcaster, any YouTuber, influencer, you need to build up the like, know, and trust in order to become a fan of the show. Now, if you have a weekly show, it takes quite a while for people to build up the like, know, and trust. But if you have a daily show, then he remains top of mind for new listeners who discover this podcast. It's hard for them to forget about him because, again, it's a daily show and it's constantly top of mind. That's how he was able to build massive momentum. I'm not saying for you to do a daily show. There's something to be said about posting an episode more than once a week. We've seen it with our clients where they start posting just twice a week and their downloads per episode starts to grow more and more and more. And it's because they're speeding up the rate in which it takes for someone to become familiar and to build the habit of listening to the show, simply by going from once per week to twice per week. So let me have a think about how you can increase your output, even if it means, having like a 5 or 10 minute bite-sized episode. That's totally fine, and that's what we encourage our clients to do. Now, Gary, he took it to the extreme. For him, he did a daily show, and that paid massive dividends. That's more on the emotional side, if you want to call that emotional side, where it's like people build the like, know, and trust way faster. But technically speaking, it was a great move for Gary to make as well. When it comes to podcast SEO, it's simply meaning the process of ranking your show higher on Apple and Spotify. That's the main platform new listeners go to discover new shows to listen to. The higher you rank, the faster you grow shows. The more keywords you rank for, the more entry point new listeners have to discover your show. If you have a podcast about, let's say, business, and you're able to rank on page 1 for sales, operations, marketing, content strategy, you're going to grow pretty fast because when someone searches in content strategy, your podcast pops up. When someone searches in sales, your business podcast pops up. When it says in operations, you're on page 1. That's the power of podcast SEO. Now, why is that important when it comes to Gary's show and him posting daily, and how can you do the same? Well, simply put, by Gary posting daily, he could rank way faster and way higher on Apple and Spotify. He could target very specific keywords which compound over time. If you wanted to rank for a specific keyword in history, or like China or Japan history, or a certain place or a certain time, it doesn't matter, a certain period, he could just cover that content way more, and by nature of that, his show could rank way higher. It could rank on page 1. And because he's covering a bunch of different topics, it means he gets a wide breadth. He gets a large cross sections of keywords, which simply mean entry points for a new listener to discover his amazing podcast. And that's the power, again, of podcast SEO combined with what Gary was doing, which is increasing his weekly output. Think about it. How much faster could you rank for specific keywords on Apple or Spotify if you just increase your output to twice a week? And again, don't pull out a gun and be like, hey, twice a week, that's a lot. And I know this feels hard to kind of see, why would I invest more time into my show when I'm not getting an ROI? But as you'll come to see in just a moment from one of Gary's lessons, which I'm about to break down just now, you have to treat your podcast like a business. And this really is the 4th lesson we learned from Gary. Gary invested in this podcast from day 1. He wasn't shy about investing more time or more energy or even more money when it came to promoting on other people's shows or spending money on advertising on streaming platforms. Gary treats his podcast like a business from day 1. He didn't expect to get an ROI without first investing a ton. Beyond just your average software cost for the month or the time you invest in a weekly show, like really going all in and treating it like a business. And the same way you wouldn't expect to get an ROI from your business without investing money into your business, you shouldn't expect for your podcast to magically blow up and start paying you literally 6 figures plus, which is what Gary is making from your show, without you initially investing more into the podcast. So for Gary, he did invest in promotion, guest features, getting the right tools and having the right systems in place. He was very strategic and very intentional. Just having a business mindset when it comes to your podcast, which if you're an entrepreneur and expert, you probably have the business, but you kind of fall into this trap of number 1, treating it like a hobby, not this thing that can reach your ideal customers and clients, which is a mindset shift you have to make, right? And then number 2 is you get into this trap of essentially not investing into the podcast because the podcast isn't making you money. But it's like, well, which one comes first? And the one that does come first is you treating it like a business first and investing and pouring your heart into it, not being scared to invest. And knowing that the more you invest into the show, the more ROI you'll get longer term. People want to be like Stephen Bartlett, but Stephen Bartlett's team probably costs him like millions to run each year. And he's got one of the biggest podcasts in the UK, one of the biggest podcasts in the world. That required a lot of money. He wasn't just waiting for the podcast to magically start paying him back. He had to invest so much into the show first in order for things to work out. And for you, you have to do the same. And that's exactly what Gary did, and his show, of course, blew up. Now, I'm not saying you're going to get to 1.5 million downloads per month by the end of the year, but you'll definitely be way further ahead, growth and monetization-wise, once you have this business-first mindset and apply it to your podcast. Clarity will fuel your commitment. For Gary, obviously, I mentioned that he's invested a lot into his show. He spent a lot of money advertising and done a bunch of different stuff. But the truth is, Gary had complete clarity in terms of what steps he needed to take to get to his goals. Gary mentioned how he actually broke down systematically how many downloads per episode he would need to be making in order to sell advertisement spots onto a show. That's how he monetized. He sells advertising and sponsorships on his show. So he just worked out how many downloads per month, how much impressions he needs to make per month in order to hit 6 figures or above. And hence why he completely went all in on a daily show. It wasn't just this random thing. It was like, oh, if I do a daily show, not only will I build like no one trust a lot faster and reach more of the right people, not only will I compound my podcast SEO and increase my discovery points, but also business-wise, it just makes sense because if I want to make 6 figures or more per year, I need to be hitting a certain number of downloads per day or per month. So he made the decision and he went all in. But the truth is he wasn't able to do that without having that clarity first. So the lesson here is if you find that you are finding it difficult to invest into the show, either with more time or with money, it's probably because you don't have clarity around how to grow the show. Like if you knew the exact steps you need to take in order to grow your podcast, you'd be doing it already. And if you're not doing it, it's because you don't have that clarity. And because you don't have that clarity, then it's hard for you to fully commit. You're doing the show, you are working hard, you are putting a lot of time and effort into it, but you're still a bit hesitant to invest into the show. And it's because you don't have that clarity there. And then most people, because they don't have the clarity, they just end up in this weird place where they're posting content, the content's really valuable and good, they're promoting on social media, which doesn't actually work, but they're just stuck in the nuts and bolts of promoting the show. And they just hope that if they just keep at it for long enough, again, it's what we call hope market, hopefully the show will take off. Then 2 years goes by and it's like, what am I getting? Well, the show feels really hard to do and it's not picking up much traction. And that's when the incentive and the energy and the effort starts to dwindle, which then means the quality of the podcast then suffers. And then the show doesn't grow as much, which then makes you feel crap and not really incentivized to give the show more. So maybe, just maybe, if you do want to grow your podcast, if you do want to monetize, maybe it's time to carve out some times and actually ask yourself some extremely important questions about your show. Like, who exactly are you trying to reach with your podcast? Who's your ideal avatar? I don't say everyone. Who specifically are you trying to reach? Because if you don't know that, how are you going to attract more of the right people? How can you apply some of Gary's strategy of targeted promotions on other people's podcasts or guessing on other people's podcasts if you don't know the audience you're trying to reach? How will you know what podcast audiences makes most sense for you to drive growth? You won't. What are your revenue goals for your podcast? You mentioned you want to monetize, but does that mean, would you be happy with $5 a month or $100 a month for the time and effort you're putting in? Probably not. My clients would be bloody devastated. Oftentimes my clients want to close 1 to 3 clients per month from their show, which would equate to around $10,000 per month with their show. A lot of our clients, unlike Gary, we focus on turning listeners into clients for our business. We have coaching programs, services, courses. That's where we focus in on, high ticket sales through the podcast. And that works really well. But again, if you didn't have clarity on that goal, how will you create a podcast that is in alignment to generating more leads from your show? It doesn't just happen. You don't just build an audience and then money just appears into your bank account. I wish that was the case. That would be awesome. But it's not the case. So again, how much revenue are you trying to make from your show if you say you want to monetize? And then ask yourself, reverse engineer this. How many downloads do you need per episode in order to hit those goals? What skills do you have to up level? Or what area of your podcast do you need to invest in? Is it your strategy? Do you need to get like an expert guidance, like a team like ours, the Get More Listens Academy, which is a one-on-one program for entrepreneurs and experts who want to grow and monetize, where we literally hold your hands the entire way of growing your show, having the right system and the right strategy to take the show to the next level? Is it maybe your equipment and your team? Maybe your workflow sucks. You have to actually just invest in a new team member to help you with that. Is it your production? Whatever it might be, like what areas, where are your blind spots, and how can you invest more into that in order to fix it? These are important questions we have to start asking ourselves if we want to take our shows to the next level. These are important questions that Gary was extremely confident in, that gave him clarity in order to go all in. It doesn't just happen. Now, of course, we have this YouTube channel to help you along with that and help you grow and level up your show. Hence why I'm making this video and making this entire channel just for you. So to recap, here is the cheat code from a podcaster getting 1.5 million downloads per month that you can start using to grow your show way faster. Number 1, don't rely on social media in order to grow. Have a more focused, targeted strategy where you target and promote within the podcast ecosystem in order to reach podcast listeners where podcast listeners are. Number 2, craft a very bold and a very clear USP. What's your unique selling point? What makes your show different from everyone else within your space? For Gary, he had a daily show that was 10 minutes, that was for a very particular type of person, talking about everything everywhere, all related to history. He had his USP that made him stand out. Number 3, volume. Increase volume. You can increase your output of your podcast. It doesn't have to be a weekly show. By simply increasing the output of your show, you speed up the process of like, know, and trust, which helps you build massive momentum with your audience. But it also creates way more discovery points when it comes to the technical side of podcast SEO. The more episodes you put out, the more keywords you can rank for. The more keywords you can rank for, the more places new listeners can find your show when they start searching specific keywords on Apple and Spotify. And of course, this grows and compounds over time. Number 4, treat your podcast like a business and invest accordingly. And then finally, number 5, clarity fuels commitment. Get clear on what your actual podcast goals are. Why do you keep doing this? What does an ideal situation with your show looks like? And what steps do you have to start taking today in order to hit those goals? they won't just happen by magic. They'll happen by you taking intentional action towards it. And that's exactly what Gary did. I hope you found this super valuable. I know I definitely did. Gary shared so much with us. It was pretty awesome. And I'm glad I could share this with you because there are so many surprising lessons that come from this. And I hope you can see that you can do it. All the time, all the effort, all the energy you've invested into the show, it doesn't have to be for nothing. You can make it. I know you can make it. I've seen so many of my clients I've worked with turn their show around, going from the verge of quitting their shows to finally blowing up their podcast. So it is possible. You can do it. You just need the right strategy in order to grow and monetize your show. Look, if you enjoy this, be sure to leave a like and a comment down below. And if you want to see more, be sure to subscribe. And with that being said, I'll catch you in the next video.